Thank you so much, Robert, for your kind introduction. And I'm very pleased to be with you today. In particular, as you have set me such a challenging topic, which I will try to make sense of in the next 30 to 40 minutes, as Robert has said. Now, the title, I'll just repeat it briefly to set the scene for how I will structure my intervention, is Geoeconomic Challenges and the Future of Europe. So what I will do in the first part of my talk, I would like to set out the world that we are in and really put that up for debate if you in the audience would agree with this basic analysis where the world is today after more than a year of COVID-19 crisis, but also where it might be going. So I will also discuss the major global trends that I see which have accelerated through the COVID-19 crisis. And then in the second part, I would like to turn to the question, how should Europe think about itself in this environment? Hannes Swoboda mentioned transatlantic relations, mentioned Russia, of course, China. And I will try to suggest a framework, how to think about Europe's role in this global, geoeconomic, and very competitive world, and then come to a few practical conclusions on what Europe should do and focus on internally to make itself a stronger player in this world. And Hannes Swoboda asked or suggested that we may be in disagreement or agreement, and I can say as soon as now that I think our analysis overlaps quite a bit, but I would be happy to discuss with you after my introductory talk whether that is really true. Now, what is this world that we are living in? The title says it's a geoeconomic world. What is that? The term really, I mean, it's a term which has been used for a while, in particular in academic research, but in the policy world, this term of a geoeconomic world really gained importance during the 4 years of the Trump presidency. For Europeans, one of the shocking elements of his presidency was how he used a combination of classical security and defense tools and economic and financial tools, all combined, not necessarily used, but threats that guarantees in terms of security could be withdrawn. So he used a combination of economic, financial, and security tools basically to pursue US interests in this world. In addition, and this is really the one characteristic of the Trump era that adds to that in an important way, is he questioned the system of multilateralism. So he actively weakened international organizations. He questioned US membership, US financial contributions, but also the whole sense of multilateral approaches to international problem solving by going into bilateral power games and the attempts to solve problems ad hoc, bilaterally, leaving aside the traditional partners and of course allies of the United States in many cases. So this left Europe with a very difficult situation because the way Europe set up itself in this international order was really relying on rules, relying on the rules-based international order, very much focusing on its own internal rules-based European order, and assuming that problems would be solved in the framework of institutions according to rather clear procedures. So the setup which Europe grew up in basically was always US dominated, but it was never turned against Europeans in the way that Donald Trump did this. Now, the COVID crisis hit in this situation where Europe was already in this quite, state of shock, I would say, and trying to figure out how it would define its own role and devise its own tools to tackle those new challenges that came upon us. And the COVID-19 crisis, in my view, in particular, accelerated the not what I said about Donald Trump's approach to the international order, but I would pick up one other element that is important for US-European relations, and that is the standoff with China between the US, which for a number of years now has been trying to decelerate or even stop the rise of China. And China that is accelerating its own weight in the world in economic terms, in financial terms, in terms of defense, and its potential, of course, power base that it has been building through a number of initiatives to which I will come in a minute. So in the COVID-19 crisis, because of the different speed in tackling the crisis, and of course also because of the different tools that were used in autocratic states like China is, or in Western liberal democracies, the pandemic was contained in different ways and slower in the Western liberal world, I dare say. Also, in its battle for a growing global power, China used the pandemic through mask diplomacy or vaccine diplomacy to actually expand its influence and also improve its image. I'm not sure this will have worked in the long term because of the doubts around the effectiveness of the Chinese vaccine. However, it became very clear that China used the access and the influence it had already built, in particular in this new crisis situation, to work with those countries it has identified earlier on as strategic for its own expansion of power and its geographical footprint, which goes well into the European Union. And I'll come to that in a minute. So all that is to say that in the pandemic, the big shifts of power from the geographical West to the East may have actually accelerated. We will see that probably only in 1 or 2 years' time, how this plays out. But since the 1990s, we are discussing this global power shift. And what we need to recognize today as Europeans is, of course, that we have lost out on a number of variables that we can use to measure this power shift. In economic terms, I have already mentioned that the COVID-19 crisis, partially because of the length of the crisis as we have it in Europe, weighs heavily on our economic recovery and also pushes back the date of economic recovery. While China was able to open earlier, and the US under the new president, Joe Biden, have had huge successes in vaccinations and hence are moving faster towards reopening than we might have thought already still 6 months ago. But also the new US administration has put forward a huge stimulus package. So the US economy is both recovering and this package is supporting major transitions, notably in the field of digital and also climate change. So we have to realize as Europeans that in this power shift, we of course still have our own base. And I'll come to the single market in a minute, but that generally also in matters of defense and security, powers are shifting towards the East and notably driven by China. Let me just mention that we can observe a very determined and serious modernization of the Chinese military. And of course, in the news, we regularly see the presence of Chinese vessels in the South China Sea. And the question is all the time, so what is the strategic aim that China is going for? But behind this is a decided effort to modernize, in particular, the Chinese Marine. And defense expenditure has actually outgrown GDP growth. So the growth of defense expenditure is higher than the growth of GDP for more than now 12 or 13 years in a row. So these are important developments we have to bear in mind when we think about Europe's role going forward. Let me now briefly come to the question of the political West and the geographical West. We have a new situation now with Joe Biden as he has come into office. He clearly has made it one of his priorities to build a broader political alliance. Of course, he has reaffirmed NATO as the core security alliance that brings the transatlantic partners together. But beyond that, he has directed his attention to other partners in the world. And one of the notable meetings, because it came so quickly, of the new US administration was with the Quad, which basically reaches into the Indo-Pacific area through the participation of Australia and Japan and South Korea. So the competitive situation with China does not change despite the change of administration, but the approach to it changes because there is a clear attempt to build a broad Western liberal alliance, an alliance of democracies that face China. Why is that so? This is not only because of the power shifts that I have described, but because this relationship with China and the competition with China is more and more conceptually framed as a systemic competition between two distinct models of governance. And obviously, China is a one-party state, often characterized as an autocratic regime. And what we have seen as an accelerating trend through the COVID-19 crisis is its use of tech-based surveillance and actually the strengthening of the grip of power and control on the society through the Chinese regime. As such, this is nothing new because this has been built up with the control of internet, which goes way back, with the control of payment flows, with the full control of social media, and the decoupling of the digital internet and social media sphere for Chinese users from other countries, and in particular American providers. But what is new is really in the pandemic that China has increased its efforts to export this kind of technology, which autocracies outside China, but also countries that may be working towards the aim of becoming more of an autocratic regime are actually using. And an interesting element here is that China doesn't only export the technology it has, but it also exports the know-how. So there are reports on Chinese seminars that are offered with the purchase of certain surveillance systems, where you get, if you want, you can use the trainings on internet control, on media control, and so on. So I believe that we do face an acceleration of autocratic trends in Europe, in the world. And if you look at the indicators that some non-governmental organizations put out, you can see very clearly that there is an acceleration and broad spread of autocratic regimes, and accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis. Now, let me briefly turn to Europe in all of this. First of all, one of the challenges for the European Union is to position itself in that power competition between the US and China. And I'm speaking to you as a German who is, of course, well informed about the German debate. And what I observed over the past years was really a phase where German policymakers, but also European policymakers, try to take a position of, we hope we don't have to decide. And this was really during the Trump times. Now the situation has changed because the way the US approaches Europe in handling China has changed, but there's still a very clear expectation that Europe to some extent sides with the US and is part of the political West facing China. Now, how does this play out, and why is it for Europe more difficult than Americans would have expected to take very clear positions here? It is obviously the very close economic and financial ties that have been built with China. And they go two ways, of course. European exports to China are important, but also the other way around. But then also foreign direct investment, which is more important from a European perspective in China than the other way around. But China's investment in Europe has been done in a very, very strategic way. First of all, in terms of building access, accessing infrastructure, accessing certain geographies, but also accessing political choices. And the way we can see Chinese influence working out in the EU system is indeed that some countries have become over the past years, and this is not a COVID phenomenon, have become more reluctant to vote, for instance, on sanctions on China or on criticism of human rights abuses, both in the EU context, but then also in the context of the United Nations. And most recently, Hungary, it didn't stop, but it delayed the European position on the human rights violations on the Uyghurs. So I think this is something that we have to bear in mind, that China is already a player. And one senior diplomat once said to me, when we discuss certain topics in the EU context, China always sits at the table, which is obviously a very strong statement, but it gives us some idea of what Europe has to deal with when it devises its own China strategy. I'll briefly comment on where Europe is on China strategy. First of all, there has been quite some movement in Europe's thinking about China. I cannot say there is a full consensus, but there is a growing shared analysis of what China represents to Europe. And of course, as I said, it's an important economic partner. Also, in terms of research cooperation on some issues, China has been part, at least, of European thinking about how to develop itself. Then China is, of course, the systemic competitor, which I've just outlined. And this is where Europe has to balance its own position. More recently, a debate has begun within the European Union, which has not yet led to a strategic document. And that is the whole question of how Europe should deal with the Indo-Pacific. And that is where I see dynamics coming up for two reasons. One is that several European governments have already issued their own Indo-Pacific strategies with different focuses. If you look at, for instance, the French approach, it was initially mostly security-based, mostly in terms of hard security and defense matters. The German guidelines for the Indo-Pacific, which came out last year as an all-government paper, so not only from a foreign policy or defense perspective, but really embracing the whole of government. It is a paper which is important in the way that China is the elephant in the room and develops a strategic approach for Germany, how to engage more with the Indo-Pacific region in many ways, ranging from closer economic ties, closer academic and research exchange, but then also, of course, joint projects in the development of technologies and so on, and then going to foreign policy approaches. And also the question is raised of to what extent, from a German perspective, security and defense matters play a role. The EU doesn't yet have the strategy, but because, and that's my second reason why I think there will be an acceleration of process here, the United States clearly have identified the Indo-Pacific as an arena where it wants to engage more strongly. And I mentioned this early on. So Europeans will be pushed, and I think in a good way, to think more together and to enable themselves to get a better assessment of how they can deal with that region, of course, with China being a major player. Let me conclude this first analytical part by saying that the European Union, of course, has started to look at its own neighborhood in a different way. Here, Russia comes in as a player, but also China. If we look at the way the EU has tried to compensate the situation that it has moved too late on, in particular, Eurasia, but also the Eastern neighborhood grouped in the Eastern Partnership. And China has already built its presence also in the Western Balkans. The EU has tried to catch up, for instance, through devising its connectivity strategy, which is not quite as forceful as the Belt and Road Initiative, but which is, at least shows that the European Union has understood that it needs to be more present and more strategically present in the region. Final point on Europe in this new geopolitical world, which has been shaped and reshaped and accelerated in its trends by the COVID-19 crisis. Europe indeed thinks about its dependencies on other actors in a very different way now after this COVID-19 experience. And I wish to remind us all that in the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, as I said in the beginning of my talk, Donald Trump was still the US president. And maybe you remember this one incident where he said, oh, there is a German company which may be developing a vaccine. Why don't I just buy it and make it American? And this shows you that this appetite for strategic investment, but also for gaining control of strategic industries at that point in time was also something that the US very forcefully wanted to use. So it wasn't only China, but it was really both major players. And Europe at that time changed its thinking, but it had already done so under the Juncker Commission. When Jean-Claude Juncker still was Commission President, the European Commission launched an initiative that basically obliges all EU member states to set up control mechanisms for strategic investment in critical industries. And interestingly, the implementation into national law happened under the impression of the COVID-19 crisis, because essentially all the national laws had to be amended until October 2020 in order to comply with the European framework that had been set up earlier. And the interesting element here is one that suddenly health industry became or was recognized as a strategic industry, but also because of the asymmetry in the economic development, there was a very strong concern that China could use the COVID-19 crisis for purchasing its way into value chains and getting into critical industries other than, of course, health. So the debate broadened and deepened. And in my view, it helped Europeans to get a more strategic view on top of the economic view of what a good relationship with China looks like, to be more cautious in the political assessment of how the regime in China may play out certain dependencies that exist or that might increase in the future. So today we are in a place where I would say, from an American perspective, the European protection mechanisms are not what they should be, but from a European perspective, they have devolved quite a bit. We will soon be in a place, once those mechanisms have worked for a year, that there will be transparency, because one of the ideas of the European framework is actually to provide data collected from the member states to provide a fuller picture of strategic investments, not only from China, but any player basically in the European Union. And it's one important brick for the European Union to build a stronger resilience. Of course, the topic of industrial policy that Hannes Swoboda has mentioned prominently also comes in more forcefully under the impression of the great power competition, the systemic competition, the new geoeconomic world, and then the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. So we have seen over the past year several efforts of member states to revise their industrial policy strategies. But what we see right now is still pretty much a patchwork of national initiatives or strategies, and some of them are purely industrial, some of them include the element of tech and digital. Some countries have in particular AI strategies or other strategies on particular domains of high priority tech development. And the European Union now, with the new commission in place, is developing into that direction as well, to rethink tech policy, to move towards rethinking industrial policy. And I wish to add to that, but this is only a very, very, let's say, preliminary or pre-debate, the question of the competition policy framework that the European Union has. We can come back to that in the debate, but I now wish to turn to how we should think about the conceptual framework, what the European Union should be doing in this new world which we have. Now, first of all, I would suggest 3 or 4 lines of thinking. One is, there is the systemic competition, And Europe very clearly should be part of the liberal political West. Not only in its way it approaches its external relations and it's thinking about dependencies, partners, allies, and so on, but also in the way it looks at itself. And in that regard, the backsliding of democracy within the European Union has become an increasing problem. And if I had to forecast this, I would think that the new US administration, as it builds closer dialogue and ties with Europe, will also bring up that issue. Not only for within the European Union, but we also have issues within the NATO alliance, of course, with the developments in Turkey. So Europe should prepare for this, but not only because the US may push it on us as a debate, but really because we have to be very concerned that over years we have been watching the developments in Hungary, also in Poland, which are of different quality, but still, which in my view have reached limits where we have to say we have countries that are deliberately working against the principles they signed on to when they joined the European Union. There are also problems in other countries, of course. We have cases of questions of media freedom or violence against journalists. There are cases of corruption, which are well spread and have potentially taken on a greater dimension in the COVID-19 crisis. As a German speaking to you, of course, the whole mass corruption scandal we had in Germany really leaves its traces. And what I'm saying here is just we have to be very alert that our democracies and the principles and values of our democracies are fragile and they are being challenged from within the system, but also from the outside. Secondly, how do we think about Europe in terms of alliances? Of course, we are most EU member states are part of NATO. And so from a military and strategic perspective, this is the major alliance that provides security to Europe as a continent. Within that, Europe has started to build, and that was a reaction both to Donald Trump and Brexit, has tried to build its own cooperation on defense matters with the so-called PESCO, the European Structured Defense Cooperation, which was born at the end of 2019. So from this perspective, and PESCO is compatible with NATO, although there are sometimes squabbles of cooperation, and there have been doubts on the US side, whether this was actually going to lead Europe to a situation where they want to turn away from the United States. I don't think this was ever the case, and I don't think that Europe would in any case get close to such a situation anytime soon. So we are reliant on the Western Defense Alliance, and all our discourse on strategic autonomy, which is an important concept in the European debate, in my view, has to take into account that this is not anything that should help us turn away from the United States, but that should increase our ability to act. So we should become a stronger player, and we should be able to take independent decisions. But it doesn't mean it's an alternative that we are building to this alliance. There are interesting elements that have led Europe to really recognizing that it is not capable to act in many ways. And I will just cite one, and we can come to more in the debate. And that was the situation when the US administration under Donald Trump's leadership decided to leave the agreement with Iran, the JCPOA. This is an agreement that European players co-signed, and they said, well, if the US leaves, we would still like to remain part of this because we think this is the right way forward to work with Iran and to prevent a nuclear Iran, basically. And what happened then was that Europeans very rapidly realized that because of the extraterritorial sanction regimes, and also because Europe lacked instruments, it simply wasn't able to implement its own policies. And that's just one example that sticks with Europeans today. They remembered, although with the Biden administration, there's a new effort on Iran. This learning is there, that Europe in many ways, through 4 years of Donald Trump, faced its own inability to actually defend its own positions on certain matters of international affairs. So this should remain as a frame for our thinking going forward, that we should build capacity to act, and we have to look at how we do that. The third theme that I would like to put forward is we have to work on our internal coherence. And Hannes Swoboda mentioned this in his introductory remarks. Today we have debates on the East-West divide, which in some countries are pretty serious and go as far, and you said that, as questioning Eastern enlargement. I think here we have a really, really important political task, which has to happen in the EU 27 as a whole, but for which there are also a number of partners that should use their own smaller formats to deal with this question. Just to quote one, which is completely underused over the past years, and that is the Weimar Triangle, which brings together France, Germany, and Poland. Here we have a group of major and important countries who lie on both sides of the East-West divide. And of course, it is important to use any format possible to try and build bridges and build coherence within the European Union, both on political questions, but we also have to look at socio-economic questions. Then there is, of course, the North-South divide, which has been there basically always in terms of the systemic differences between the economic growth models and the economic governance models that we see between country groupings. And it's obviously only a very broad characterization. And of course, you can refine it and you can't be that simple as I am now in my speech. But the North-South divide sits with the EU and in particular with the Eurozone. And we saw that surfacing, and it wasn't born then, but it resurfaced. It was there during the Maastricht Treaty negotiations in the early 1990s, but during the sovereign debt and banking crisis, this whole difference of both economic performance, of thinking about economic recovery, of reliance on fiscal policy, of thinking about debt and deficit. This all surfaced in the years after 2010, when the sovereign debt and banking crisis hit the Eurozone. But it also, of course, continues now in the COVID crisis. And if you look back at spring 2020, there were very, very strong tensions in the relationships between those countries that asked for a quick European support early on and asked for transfers rather than loans and asked for Euro bonds, while others organized in a grouping called the Hanseatic League very strongly spoke up against it. And there was a moment of real political tension, which was then managed, and we ended up with having the Recovery Fund, which uses European instruments to raise money in the markets, and which includes transfers and not only loans. So we made an important step forward as Europeans, but under the surface, those tensions still remain. The fourth frame I would like to suggest is that we need to think about our own resilience. This is really something that we need to take away from the, I think today now realistic debate of providing security to European citizens. The term resilience found its way into the global strategy that was published when Federica Mogherini was High Representative of the European Union, so 5 years ago, or more than 5 years ago today. And what does that term say? It basically says we are vulnerable, and the state and governments will never be able to provide full protection. So what we have to think about is, how do we bounce back? How do we make our societies, our economies, our critical infrastructure resilient in the sense of, when attacks happen, we have put the system in place beforehand, so there is the possibility of a self-recovery of the system. This, of course, is something that may be frightening to some because of the new threat environment we are in. The terrorist attacks, the cyber warfare, hybrid warfare more generally, that Europe is going through, have really changed the concept of security, and have made it clear that it's no longer only our defense ministries that provide for security, but we have to think about this far more broadly and far more also in terms of protecting our economic systems, and in particular, protecting the democratic resilience of our systems and of our societies. So within that framework, I think the priorities for the European Union in order to be able to have the internal strength to act globally is, first of all, we have to look very closely at what the COVID-19 crisis has done to our economies. We have a number of issues we haven't tackled, although we know we should have. That is in particular the completion of the Eurozone. Today, when we talk about our problems with not being competitive in the area of tech, of having startups move to the United States and try their luck there, one of the important discussions that always comes up is the problems to get funding, the lack of depth of our capital market in Europe. Conceptually, the ideas are all out there. Capital Markets Union is developed conceptually. We know we have to complete our banking union. We know, and the COVID-19 crisis has really put that on the table clearly, that the Stability and Growth Pact will need some kind of reform. Right now it is on hold, but it is very hard to imagine from today's perspective that we will go back to the pre-COVID setup. There's a lot of pressure building up to review the fiscal rules we have and also the methods of economic coordination. Secondly, I think the whole area of tech policy is crucially important. This is not only a question of competitiveness, but also a question of whether we can make use of the single market, which we have, which of course is a huge asset, being in terms of consumers, a far bigger market than the United States, with 450 million consumers in Europe and 328 million consumers in the United States. We have something here to leverage, but we will not be able to catch up in the technological race and to maybe lead on some technologies unless we do this with partners. So I think this is a topic where Europe has its own job to do, but then to look and work very closely with the United States. Finally, in terms of external affairs, I think the European Union needs to put more thinking, and again, together with the US, into its role globally in reforming and strengthening multilateral institutions and the multilateral order. Of course, we know it has to change. We have known that since we started discussing the power shifts towards Asia and the rise also of Africa. All countries or regions which are underrepresented in some of the mechanisms or institutions we have today. So what we have seen over the past years is the development of alternative regional mechanisms, in particular in Asia. Take the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank as an example. But what Europe really needs to think through is how can it defend its own interests in this shift that the global order is going through and the multilateral institutions are going through. And I believe in terms of trade, it's very clear that Europe has a huge interest in a rules-based international order. In terms of health, I think the past year has told us that the WHO isn't quite strong enough. The US have returned. This is a good start, but we need to look at how this mechanism can be made even stronger. The United Nations will need a reform in order to be more effective. And as I said earlier on, the US president is starting to think about new alliances and new constellations of states and has said he would like to bring together a summit for democracies. So how does Europe position itself on that? How does it want to participate as the EU in this, or will just the member states go? And how does it understand this new grouping of countries in its relationship to the other fora that we already have, like the G20, the G7, and others? So I will leave you with these thoughts, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for these thoughts and very, very broad topics. As we see, China is sitting on the table everywhere, and I think this is one of the big issues one has to debate, and I think the European position is not that clear as it should be maybe, but this is to be developed. We have already a couple of questions in the chat function. For those who want to pose questions and you would like to see that all participants see, please, at the very bottom of the screen, you find a button where you can click all participants, all discussions and participants, or all panelists and attendees. Else only the 5 of us get the questions, but I will pass it on to Daniela anyway. But if you want to have all of the participants can read, then you have clicked this all panelists and attendees at the button at the screen. Okay, before going to the chat, maybe Hannes, you start and having some reactions on the presentation and the thoughts by Daniela.
Well, thank you. I couldn't agree more with what Daniela said. I think it was a very broad overview, and so there's not much to add, if anything. And I saw some of the questions already, and I will not take the questions away from the others. Maybe two remarks or questions, Daniela. The first one, you have been active in many institutes, think tanks, and so on. If you look to the European Union, they do very often the right thing, but they do it quite late or too late. You mentioned the investment strategy, the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think very often we come late as European Union. But the knowledge is here with the institutes you have been before and so on. So how do you see the procedural? How could institute think tanks have more influence, or should they have more influence on the political debate, or more contact with the Commission, because it's much more difficult? I think in the US, if you look also to the Biden administration, you have many people coming from different these institutes, but it's not so in Europe. And maybe the second question is, I don't want to deal with China because somebody else will ask already. Africa, you mentioned Africa only once. Africa is our neighbor. It's a resource, could be a resource of labor force if we need it. Anyway, there's migration. So maybe you can mention a bit, make a remark on the question of Africa, and especially in the migration issue, how Europe should deal with it. Can deal, of course, we have the internal migration issue also with the Balkans and so on, but maybe on these global aspects. Otherwise, I'm fully in agreement, and thank you very much indeed for your broad overview.
Okay, thank you. So maybe you.
Thank you very much. So how can think tanks have more impact? You mentioned one essential difference between Europe and the United States, and that is the revolving door principle. That, as you see now, you know, all the think tankers, some of us know, who have just moved into the Biden administration. Those are people who, of course, have spent a lot of time conceptually thinking, and in particular engaging a lot with Europeans during the Trump years. Really a number of people who are now in very prominent positions on Europe or on China have invested a lot in building relationships with Europeans, in particular when the Trump administration tried to be, you know, was very pushy and tried to, you know, not pay particular attention to that kind of work. So that is obviously a huge opportunity that exists in the US system. Personally, I've tried to build that same, you know, principle the other way around, bringing people out of policymaking into the think tank I led until last week. It is very difficult on a domestic scale to change the habits and to change the perspectives of people who feel, you know, if they leave a certain position to join a think tank for a while, will they be back with the same appreciation of colleagues they had before? Those are tricky issues, but we have to work on them, and I'm really convinced we should. The other thing is, of course, that in the US system, the number of jobs that are actually political nominations are far more, but really, I mean, so much more than, for instance, we have in the German system. The political appointees that come in, you can count probably on 2 or 4 hands if we look at our next government next year, this year, end of this year. So that's what I think one of the main differences. But what are other ways for think tanks to have impact? One is, of course, go public when it's adequate. I mean, Europe by now, in my view, has made progress on a pretty transnational debate on challenges. So there are a number of media outlets. When you publish there, you know, you will be read Europe-wide. course, the social media help. So there is a more European fabric now where views are exchanged. But, and I think that is the real learning of the past years, if you want to impact foreign policy or European policy, you have to do it in a way that those who decide know they can sell it to their constituencies. And that's really the mantra also of the Biden administration, with their way of thinking about foreign policy, to be able to bring it home and make foreign policy for the middle class, as they have put it. So in my work with parliamentarians over the years, you know, I have learned to think also, or to see the discourse that we as a foreign policy crowd have through their eyes, and to understand what the problems are that they are encountering. And those are not only big global or security or single country issues like US, Russia, China, but in particular European issues, questions of European solidarity. If, you know, I remember the debates in the German parliament on the financial rescue mechanisms during the sovereign debt and banking crisis. Those were extremely tough, extremely emotional debates that parliamentarians had to face in their home constituencies and in the media. So that's also the job of a think tanker, to understand the context. If you just put out a smart idea and you hope someone will read it and embrace it and run with it, that is not going to happen. You have to always bear in mind how the political process works, when the window of opportunity is to plant an idea. And some ideas may be huge and they may not materialize for a long time, but you may have planted it and you are there to advise on it. For instance, what has now been done in the COVID-19 crisis with the employee protection system, which is really a new move for the European Union to provide this. Some say it has elements of a European unemployment reinsurance scheme. Yes, those ideas have been out there for 15 years and developed. So it's good if you have them, but sometimes you will have to have a lot of patience until they are being picked up. And my final point is on impact. You have to be someone that people trust, because at the end of the day, if as a think tanker you want to have impact, what you want to do really is you want to change someone's mind, someone's thinking on a particular policy problem. And I've spoken about the politics of this, but it's also that an individual has to absorb a new idea and make it his or her own. And here a think tanker that has direct access, of course, is well positioned to go into a confidential dialogue and do it over and over again and answer questions behind closed doors. But also what you want to do as a think tanker in Europe is you want to bring people from different countries together in a confidential setting. I have invested, I guess, most of my time when I'm in dialogue formats into the Franco-German relationship. And whenever there's a new leader on one side or the other, basically you start from scratch on many things. New parliamentarians that come into new jobs, they have to learn about this relationship. They have to understand the thinking of the other. And so this is a constant task. And I see more and more that think tanks, despite the institutional contexts that grow all around, have an important role to play as well, to provide that kind of safe space and to help get a shared view of the challenges ahead. Now on migration, the internal challenges, yes, I mean, you've only alluded to them. They are huge and we know them since the year 2015, 2016, when the attempt was made, first of all, to get a balanced and fair European distribution mechanism in place for asylum seekers, but also to get a common asylum system in place. We don't have that. We don't even have a shared list of safe countries of origin. We currently have a real scandal with our Frontex agency and the violation of human rights. So European migration policy as such isn't in a good place. When we now look at the external dimension, I think we greatly underestimate the migration flows that are to come. And what only just is starting is the debate on, I mean, in the think tank world and in the research world, it has been out there for a long time. The impact of climate change as a driver of migration. So if you look at studies, you find a lot of very puzzling data of what is to come, very probably, because of food shortages, because of floods, because of whatever reason there may be for people to have to leave their homes. And in my view, the European Union is by far not prepared to act in the regions themselves to offer alternatives to people who can then stay in different settings, or to, if the EU doesn't succeed in doing this, to have a way in a humanitarian way to handle larger migration flows. So I'm quite worried on that. And then in addition, so far we have mostly, not only, but mostly been tackling migration flows from the Middle East. Of course, also some from Africa, but in relation, the flows from Africa will increase more. But still, if we look at the Middle East, also the European Union, in my view, on some situations is really not fulfilling its own standards with regards to humanitarian protection and human rights. And it has to review what has been put in place under the pressure of the migration crisis in the year 2016 and following.
Okay, thank you. Let me, before going to the chat, just on this, in this context, two questions I would like to ask in a way. You talked about this strengthening of the Western alliance now under the Biden administration with respect to multilateralism. Mm-hmm. But isn't it that, say, the Trump administration has shown that such kind of cooperatism, multilateralism depends very much on the political cycle in the US. So we don't know exactly what happens in 4 years' time when there's a new election. Maybe again it swings back and we have a different state with respect to the attitude of the US towards these multilateral stances. Second question, less related to that, but to the last point, you talked about the challenges of migration, particularly in Europe, and particularly so in the Eastern European countries. We face quite a strong demographic challenge in a way that, according to population scenarios, well, the working age population will shrink tremendously in some of the countries. So how would that align also with one of the challenges Europe faces, becoming an aging and even declining society in quite medium term in a way?
Thank you very much. I will start with the first issue on multilateralism. Yes, of course, you're exactly right. That's why the Trump administration was such a big shock, because Europeans had to learn to what extent they depend on a cooperative US, and the world depends on a cooperative US because of the power the United States have. And there is no easy answer to this, because this will always be, that, in my view, this will always be a truth. If the US does not want to cooperate, cooperation will be far more difficult, if not impossible. If you look at the climate change issue, something interesting happened, but on the one hand, I just want to confirm your position, but then say something in addition, which gives some hope. So Europeans are right now leading in some ways on thinking about climate change and climate transition. They know exactly that with a little less than 50% of global CO2 emissions coming from the US and China together, any European efforts won't have a big impact unless those two players work with Europeans on those same goals of reducing CO2 emissions. And what I think what this tells us firstly is that Europe has a role to play in this very conflictual situation between the US and China, to work with China and to try and bring it into a multilateral framework on climate that partially exists, but that needs to be developed further. But the second thing that the whole climate issue tells us, and that's sort of the positive story of the Trump years on climate, where we have a big negative story, and that is him giving up the climate goals for the US. There were actors that stepped forward and said, we still stick to those goals, and we are those places where most CO2 emissions happen in the US. So governors of states stepped forward, CEOs of major companies stepped forward, mayors of large cities said we will stick to those goals. And I think that's where you see a bit of hope, because you suddenly see on a very different level than the national government, there is a recognition that transnational issues have to be tackled on all levels, and climate change is just one of them. But for the multilateral order going forward, of course, we as Europeans, if another Trump kind of person or Trump himself stands for elections again and wins, there will be again the same troublesome situation within international organizations. And I would say the multilateral framework has survived those 4 years. If this would happen again, I believe that we would see an accelerated and stronger process of regionalization, which already is there anyway, but this could then accelerate and be more substantive. That will make it more complicated to, of course, work on global issues. So I can't really contradict your assessment. If this happens again, Europeans and other countries will become very aware again of the big power role that the US still has in this world, despite the rise of China. Can you just repeat your second question again, because I didn't take notes, really sorry for that. And you're on mute, sorry.
On the one hand, we have the debate on migration. On the other hand, we see the population scenarios that working age population in Europe is over the next 5 to 10 years, particularly in Eastern European countries, shrinking quite tremendously, if this holds true, of course. So what this kind of stands on both aspects in this way.
Yeah, hugely important issue. Also from, obviously, let me start on the geopolitical perspective. Today, the US and Europe together only have 10% of the world population. And that's not very much. So in this whole, shift of powers to other world regions, we have to bear that in mind. Because right now, we still like to say, wow, we have the single market, not only with a very large number of consumers, of course, not as big as China, but financially very powerful consumers, which is part of the reason why Europe has this very strong economic base. But the demography problem obviously goes much further than that. First of all, some countries may face a situation where pension systems are no longer sustainable, and that in a situation where public finances are under strain anyway, is of course a huge problem. Same may apply to health systems. Then we have the problem of qualified worker migration from the Central and Eastern European countries to the West, also from the Balkan countries, where of course this is of benefit to the individual and of benefit to the receiving countries, but they leave behind a problematic situation in the countries that lose their young generation. I think this is really a topic where the European Union could and should take more responsibility. One of the issues that, of course, first of all, I've already mentioned it, the sustainability of health systems in the countries where people simply leave. The second issue I'd like to bring up is the funding of university education, which of course lies on the budgets of the states that educate their young people, and then they leave with that education. So this could be a European debate as well. If a person leaves his or her home country and goes and works somewhere else, should there not be some kind of compensation maybe for the country that has made sure there is a good education? So I think there are many, many discussions we should have, because if we don't have them within the European Union, my concern is that precisely this issue, that countries lose their very strong young groups or part of population to other EU countries, that is a huge source of uncertainty for many. And if we look at the conditions of political stability in the European Union right now, there are many reasons to assume that because of social tensions, economic tensions after the COVID-19 crisis, there is a stronger polarization and possibly an easier game to play for anti-European, far right, far left, whichever way, forces that wish to destabilize the system. And I think this migration issue is also one that should be seen in that context if it serves an anti-EU narrative in a number of EU countries.
Okay, thank you for this answer. Maybe now we go to the chats and the discussions in the chat functions. I will go over and try to group them if I can overview them. So the very first one was when you, well, I think when you said that China also, well, is increasing in military power. The question is, please compare the amount of GDP spent on defense by the US and China, and how many bases does the US have worldwide compared to China? So I think this is in the line on comparing the military power of these two big nations.
Yes, so I don't have the numbers here. I'm very sorry for that. But I may have, no, I can't remember the numbers by heart, so I don't want to say anything wrong. But I just want to say one thing on this issue. And that is, you know, you can easily find the numbers on defense expenditure in the so-called CIPRI yearbook, which is a Swedish think tank that compares defense expenditure year on year. And there you will see that the US still spend more. However, what experts say about the Chinese situation is that, first of all, there's a deliberate strategy in the government's tech development strategy to develop dual-use technologies. And so they can be used for military purposes, but they are treated not necessarily as military development. Secondly, there is apparently, and that only experts can judge who look deeply into Chinese budgets, apparently a number of elements in the budget are used for military purposes, but are not tagged as that. So the large and increasingly large military defense budget in China, according to security experts, by far does not represent the funding that actually goes into military purposes through those two ways that I've just described.
Okay. So let me come then to the second question. I try to group them. The first one by Hans Holzhacke is on, well, the issue of the Europe-China investment agreement, which I think the ratification was stopped yesterday or today. And in line with that is basically, it's more the whole debate about, say, what Michael Landesman calls in his chat, the process of a regionalization of the multilateral framework. So we have different investment agreements, trade agreements, and whether this is inescapable and which reflects the geopolitical changes with competing rules and against this rule-based framework. So what the role of Europe should be in this play? Should we support the Western regional framework, or should we attempt to find synergies and act as a kind of bridge across competing frameworks? So should we accept competing frameworks, or should we try to have it still in a common way?
I think from a European perspective, a global approach to trade and investment is always better, but the past years, and not only now, the deal with China and its stopping of ratification in the European Parliament show us how difficult even a regional approach just is. So I think the future will be more bilateral or more interregional. And for trade and investment, I think this is manageable. What, from a European perspective, in my view, is the more strategic issue is how we think about standardization, in particular in the area of tech and digital, simply because we are not leading on this at the moment. And if we see a division of spheres between China and the US, because of our ties to both sides, this is something A, that we do not want. But B, if it has to happen and we can't prevent it, we at least want to be in one of those spheres, right? And so that's why I said earlier on, I think close cooperation with the United States on technological and digital issues, but always with the effort on the European side while cooperating, increasing our own capacities is really what we need to do. And that is not an easy thing to do, this cooperation with the United States. We, of course, have very different approaches to data regulation and so on. And we have been a first mover on some, and some of our standards have actually been adopted. My concern is just with new technologies emerging, we should be able to be in the same place. And as it looks now, we risk losing that position of strength. So that is really my prime concern. And going back to what you said, Robert, on the window of opportunity we now have with Joe Biden, and we don't know what comes after him, we of course have to be concerned, you know, and in particular, I started speaking about geoeconomics and the weaponization of economic tools. Tech regulation can possibly be one of those things that if some country or region wants to put us under pressure, can be used. So we have to be cautious, and I think we are best served in this world, which I don't want to paint in black, not at all, but I'm cautious after 4 years of Trump. The best thing we can do is invest in our own strength.
I think this holds also true for the next question, whether Europe should emphasize its environmental legislation and social conditions in these trade negotiations, which again goes, I think, in this direction.
Yeah. So
let me come to a different set of questions, which is more on the intra-EU. So one participant asks, Poland and Hungary don't seem to share the EU values anymore. With the EU intending to expand memberships to the Balkan states, isn't there the danger to increase the number of countries that only look for EU money without being willing to share EU values, plus import even more Chinese influence? Which might be also related to what is the take of you on this Chinese 16+1 format, which includes some of the Western Balkans and Eastern European economies.
Yeah. What we see, and I briefly mentioned that already, with Poland and Hungary is a very clear backsliding. If you look at the democracy indexes that are out there, and one which is called the VDEM index, Poland just scored highest in 2020 in terms of losing the highest number of points on that scale, right? So it slipped down among all countries, had the greatest degradation of its own standard. Before that, it was Hungary. So this is absolutely bad news for the European Union, and in my view, for the citizens of both countries. So let me stay there for a moment before I come to the Western Balkans. I think the EU has, first of all, wasted time, and this is not only a question of the system and the European Commission, but it's also a question of the political parties who have not been affirmative enough to actually safeguard the values that the European Union stands for, and that really the vast majority of countries in the European Union still shares. Now, is it too late now? I don't think so, but we are really in a risky situation. Of course, we can always hope for a change of government, right? But the depth of constitutional change that countries undergo, and then also the destruction of democratic fabric in the NGO world, media, so on. This can't easily, of course, it can be redone, it has to be rebuilt. But the longer you have governments that deliberately destroy the institutions and the spheres of liberal democracy, the longer it, of course, also takes to swing back. And you know, I'm just worried that we should learn from those two examples in order to be politically, but also legally, in a better place to deal with possible other countries that may want to go into a similar direction. For the Western Balkans, of course, you know, the enlargement perspective that has been developed should be maintained, in my view. But in the process of bringing the Western Balkan countries closer to the European Union, the EU has to be far more proactive in thinking about its own role beyond the enlargement negotiations. And in the question, the element of Chinese influence, I would add Russian influence, has been mentioned. And frankly, in some cases where you can clearly see China used an opportunity to be seen, to invest, to whatever, gain influence, whichever way, through the public sphere, through direct access to decision makers, through the creation of dependencies, the European Union did not act. And I think this is a big mistake, and we should look very closely at new situations coming up. It is what it is now, but the European Union needs to be far more present in its neighboring regions, and that also means it needs more investment there in order to provide a credible alternative and an attractive alternative. So I think we have to look at the situation, which is already, you know, a lost opportunity from the EU side, but turn it into a far more proactive policy. And, you know, one attempt, of course, not for the Western Balkans, but for the larger region with that connectivity strategy, which I mentioned, was made. But yeah, we shouldn't continue to be that late and that small in comparison.
So by that, what would be your stance on the Western Balkan accession process to the EU? You still think this is feasible, or this, so in 5 to 10 years time, or this is still an ongoing process? What is feasible to be managed or even speeded up due to the COVID crisis? So what would be your stance on that?
Well, this is just, you know, me watching from afar what's happening in Brussels and what's happening in the region. So other people who are on this call will know much better. I think that the political readiness to accelerate in the European Union is currently not there. So as much as one could build the argument, and I think also during the migration crisis, one could have built, or some people did, build a strong argument that at least on some issues, in particular pertaining to the migration crisis, cooperation below the level of enlargement should now be enhanced. It did not happen in a way that is, in my view, sufficient. So we should not underestimate the reluctance within the European Union. I would explain it by two factors. One is the EU is deeply occupied with itself at this moment in time. And so this, I would say, for some, and really in quotation marks, extra issue, no, there's little political energy for anyone to take a lead on that. However, some governments still persistently make the case, like, for instance, the German government, but this is one case among many they make, so it's not a priority issue at the moment. The other element is that some countries simply do not want a larger group. And in particular, given the external pressure and the continuous experience that the European Union is not able to act rapidly and forcefully enough, that actually has strengthened the other discourse on the size of the EU, and that is the one on let's move in smaller groups. Let's go back to whatever, the Eurozone or the founding six. There are many, many concepts out there, and politically they are far more attractive than thinking about a larger European Union. So that's for the politics of this. Whether we should move ahead or whether we should give up the project, I think we absolutely need to stick to it. But this is a two-sided endeavor. It's the EU that needs to serve its commitments, and maybe we will rather see a deceleration of the process for the next few years. But if we give it up, we would lose something. So I would rather recommend let's stay with it and be patient. But again, I said earlier on, the EU needs to invest more in the countries anyway, but the countries also need to deliver. And some of the developments that we see in candidate countries are clearly not serve their own purpose of becoming EU members. So it's responsibilities on both sides. I would say after the COVID year, we are not in a better place than we were before.
Okay, thanks. Well, let me stay with there's another question on another country which has an important impact on Europe, maybe, and you also mentioned it's Russia. So the question is, what is your opinion regarding the Nord Stream project, of which, as you as a German, has a particular say probably, and how should Europe's future position towards Russia be?
Yeah, favorite question. Personally, I think the Nord Stream 2 project was a real strategic mistake, and also the handling of it wasn't well done, because the government, first of all, going into this project, given the political repercussions, even if you can try and hedge the costs for Ukraine by agreeing on gas transition and guaranteeing transition through Ukraine, frankly, the geopolitical tensions that this created with countries that feel it increases dependency on Russia, it weakens the countries that are struggling with Russia, like Ukraine, but also the Polish position on this, the Baltic states, who see it as a slap in the face. So all of this brings me to my position that in the first place, it was a wrong decision to do this. There could have been other ways, instead of building a new pipeline, to import Russian gas, if that is a reasonable energy decision to be made. Second observation, the Americans, of course, continuously put pressure on Europeans. So not only the cost that this has for our European partners and our Eastern neighbors, but also the tensions that this provides with the United States, we have to factor in. Now, the German government continuously tried to sell this as a business project and basically pushed all responsibility to the side and said, no, this is just, companies working with each other. Of course, it was always a political project. And when it really was, because it was pushed to the forefront of the debate already under Trump times, and now also again with Biden, who has a different tone, but the same strategic assessment. The government is in a difficult situation. And I would guess they are not going to stop it simply because of the price this would have in terms of, one, really financial implications with the providers they have and so on. But also because some in the German government still believe that it is actually a good way to have a relationship with Russia in the sort of segment of energy imports, while on other issues with Russia, the German government, along with its European partners, is by far more confrontational than it was a few years back. And that was also the question, how do we think about our relationship with Russia? I mean, since the annexation of Crimea at the latest, we know that Russia challenges our European security order. And with the continuous military presence in Eastern Ukraine and the recent buildup of troops, we can just see this willingness of the Russian leadership to disturb and to create tensions and provoke. And of course, there is a hard security threat as well, because no one ever knows, will they do something or will they not? And they have done in Crimea. So the European Union's eastern flank, of course, has a far more developed physical security concern than others in Europe. And the big challenge for Europe is to bring those perspectives together and to develop a new approach towards China. Several attempts have been made. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, I think by now 1.5, 2 years ago, launched this initiative of a new strategic dialogue with France. In my knowledge, this really went nowhere, basically. But it's interesting if you dwell a little deeper and try to understand what the drivers of this initiative were. They were far more geopolitical than just looking at Russia's role in Europe's eastern neighborhood and within the EU. Already then, when this initiative was launched, there were concerns about a Chinese-Russian alliance. And I would say we are far from seeing the emergence of a Chinese-Russian strategic alliance. But what we do see is a tactical cooperation on many things. And that also includes energy exports. And that's, by the way, one of the arguments that those who in Germany defend Nord Stream 2 say. They say we offer an additional alternative to Russia, so they don't turn fully eastwards and just, you know, work with China and others. So I think the China case has to be brought into the debate on Russia. However, I'm not among those who say I see the emergence of a strategic alliance between the two. Russia is a very junior partner compared to China. And as far as I know, opinion poll data in Russia isn't positive towards a closer relationship with China. So there are many reasons, and rightly so, frankly, because China is a huge player that serves its own interests and not Russia's. Yeah, so I think the EU has to acknowledge what Russia is today. And this is more and more the majority view. It is a player that is internally rather weak, not the government, because it is very brutal and making sure it maintains its power base, but the country as such, from an economic perspective in particular. It is a player that leverages its presence in a number of conflicts around the EU in a broad belt in order to be at the negotiation table on many issues. And it has now achieved a big thing, I think, for Vladimir Putin, because Joe Biden is actually working actively on a bilateral summit. So this whole ambition of becoming a great power again, at least Russia is an international player that has managed to disturb to such an extent and expand its power in the Middle East in particular, that it is now part of the discussions going forward and a necessary part. And for Europe, I would say it is a serious security threat. I spoke about the hard power component, but in terms of hybrid and cyber threat, we have to take Russian interference very seriously, in particular ahead of the two major elections in Germany this September, but then also in France in spring 2022, where on the eve of Macron's last election, there was hacking that French authorities attributed to Russian interference, and that led to a very complicated campaign situation for the Macron camp because of leaked emails and fake emails just before election day.
Okay, so well, I have to be picky now with the questions because we're almost at the end of the time. So there's still two questions which I would like to ask you. Maybe we have to be short, so these are big questions. I start with another country which you also mentioned, is Iran. And basically the question is that, well, now we have these negotiations going on again in Vienna. And what is the EU, what the EU can offer to Iran in that respect? As China and Russia have already signed some sorts of strategic partnership, but the EU is still maybe lagging behind in how to deal with the Iranians. So what should be the reaction of EU and what the EU can offer to Iran for the further developments?
Yes. So the EU wanted to stick to its commitments in the JCPOA, and it couldn't because of the threat of extraterritorial sanctions coming from the US side. So any European company that would have wanted to deal with Iran or bank had to fear it would lose market access in the United States. And if you compare the market size, it's quite obvious that at least countries that are present in both markets clearly then have to decide for the US. So I think what the Europeans will need in any case is a backing of the United States and a very credible commitment that if they move forward with closing ties, and you mentioned the strategic partnership of China and Russia, the European Union would need full backing of the United States that this will not be subject to sanctions, but of course knowing that at some point it can be if we see another change of government. I think that the term strategic partnership wouldn't apply for the EU case because from the European Union's perspective, a strategic partnership is a rather developed concept. And I'm not sure that it would be on the agenda for Iran at this point, but at least the guarantees that were given in the JCPOA agreement in terms of economic ties, that is something that Europe would definitely, or at least the signatories, would definitely want to go back to. And under the new political conditions of the moment, I think they can.
And thanks. And final question on going back, leaving this area of big international relations. There's one question which is more intra-EU, and is basically on, so the COVID has some impact on countries, but particularly also cities and regions. And we see both that in the US and Europe, the economic and political divide is starting to be more and more between urban versus rural regions. And maybe that particularly applies for Europe as well, that we have some peripheral regions and some more prosperous regions. So in that kind of regional inequality aspect, how you would see the future evolving and how that can be solved maybe by EU cohesion policies, or whether this is a threat?
Well, we have a big problem of EU internal cohesion anyway, and the policies that are in place to date haven't allowed us to overcome those deep divides. Now, we have seen over the past years how this plays out politically. If you take the internal political divisions of Italy or also France, this has become a growing concern. So I think it has to be tackled both on the country level, but then also on the EU level. And of course, more instruments could be invented if there was a readiness to do so. On the positive side, I think the effect of the COVID crisis is really a re-evaluation of the way we work. And at least for what I've read for Germany, and this may apply for other EU countries as well, there's actually a move out of the cities and at least into the suburbs and the broader regions. Some really in commuting distances, which are pretty important. So what that leads me to thinking is really that we may see a spreading of urban space and a less of a concentration in the cities themselves, but with their peripheries being more interesting for people to live if they know they don't have to commute on a daily basis, and if telework becomes more important. So we'll see whether COVID actually has lasting effects in this regard. I believe that many companies and organizations are still in the process of figuring out what the value of presence at the workplace is in the future in jobs where you don't need to be physically present but can work digitally. So this may actually be an interesting development also to regions that are not that close to cities that they are automatically touched by this trend. But in general, I think we have to really worry about the discrepancy between urban development and regions lagging behind from a socioeconomic perspective, because we see more and more how this plays out politically in the European Union.
Okay, so let's conclude with that outlook. There are still some questions coming in, but I think we're already over time. So let me thank very much for this impressive talk, the impressive overview of the geopolitical and geoeconomic dimensions and challenges also, but for the insights in the discussions on intra-EU and other aspects. And thanks for having time with us, and thanks for this presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.